When we talk about the economic reforms in India, yours is the first name that comes to mind.
If you really want to affect development policy, you have to do it in your own country. First of all, parents should realize that what they think is the best career for their children may not actually be. Because the kid may have totally different ambitions and capabilities. In India, you either have an art stream or a science stream. And once you've chosen that, and you choose that at 17 or something like that, then you're really on one track. And I think that's completely wrong. That's a nice compliment. Of all the things you could have said, saying I have a hunger for learning is very, very true.
Something interesting about you that people should know.
That I take a lot of interest in what my grandkids are reading in school and even read their textbooks in order to be able to interact with them on what it is they're being taught.
Welcome to the 5th episode of Returning to Love. We have a very special guest with us today, and maybe in some ways an unexpected guest on RTL. But stay with me, you'll know how he qualifies perfectly for the same. I'm talking here about Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Thank you, sir, for having us here, for being with us. It really means a lot. When we talk about the economic reforms in India, yours is the first name that comes to mind. I recently read your book, The Backstage. Thank you so much for signing this copy for me. It is a treasured copy now. And this is truly a gift to every Indian, to every young person, and the insights that you've shared here, the wisdom that you've shared is truly valuable. I did a little experiment in the last couple of days asking people if they knew of you, and it was a very interesting discovery that came forth. I was at a coffee shop yesterday reading the book, and from the guy who made my coffee, he asked me about you, and he knew of you. From my 91-year-old grandfather to my 9-year-old nephew, from a farmer to a teacher, to, everybody, knows of you. And that's because the immense contribution that you made to our country. So, a lot of things that we take for granted today, things that are so readily available to us, right from our Nespresso capsules, to things that our cousins brought for us from America. All those things became available to us. And what we don't realize, and what I read in the book, we've read it in the newspaper, but your account was so detailed that it helped me to understand the complexities and what is it that makes these things happen, what kind of determination, perseverance, strategy in decision making is needed for bringing reforms at that level. So again, thank you.
Well, let me say thank you very much for inviting me to your show, and thank you also for all these very kind things you said. I must add here that if I'm recognized, it's not so much because of the great things we did, although I was a part of a lot of great things. It's also because that was a time when electronic media really became important. The budget used to be covered live, and I was there for a relatively long time. Most people, are there for much shorter periods. So over a long time, electronic media, I sort of got to be very well known. And I suspect that parents have told their 9-year-olds, and that's why they know about it also. But thank you so much. Very kind words.
So on a lighter note, I've always been very intrigued about the color of your pug, which is always this beautiful light blue color.
Yes.
To me, it represents the sky and dreams. How did you
That's a very nice sort of evocative explanation. The actual explanation is really very simple. And that is that, you know, when I was finance secretary, I had to travel a lot, different meetings and so on. And, you know, for a Sikh, when you're traveling, it helps a lot if you color coordinate your shirts and ties, because otherwise, you know, you're carrying too many things. So since most men's suits are blue, you end up wearing a blue shirt, and it makes a lot of sense to have a blue turban. So I kind of zeroed in on blue. Although, mind you, when I play golf and things, I mean, I wear a green turban.
Oh, okay.
So I don't only wear blue turbans.
Right.
But that's the answer.
I think you make so many decisions in your life, and this was one less thing to decide in the morning. So that's another way of looking at it. Yeah. So one thing that really struck me in the book and about your life is your hunger for learning and your innate desire to contribute. You're doing that even now, in whatever capacity that you were in. It came across very strongly, you know. So were you born with it? Is it something that one can develop? You know, this quality, it just keeps you so alive. You still have that sparkle in your eye, I would say. And
that's a nice compliment. I mean, of all the things you could have said, saying I have a hunger for learning is very, very true. I do. And actually, one of the interesting things I find is that when I interact with my grandchildren, you know, I give them advice, or they sometimes ask me questions, etc. Even from those interactions, you actually learn quite a bit. I do think in the matter of economic policy, because economic policy is a very complex thing, because the economy is a complex thing. So the worst thing that can happen is if the top leadership thinks it's simple, they know what to do, and all they have to do is to do it. Now, actually, it is true that in many, many areas, we know what to do and we're not doing it. So many people value decisiveness and ability to implement, because I think we're not very good at that. But you know, in addition to that, you have to be very clear that knowing what's the right way of achieving an objective is also not self-evident. The same objective can be achieved in 2 or 3 different ways, and each way could be more effective than the other or more costly than the other, and you have to be clear what it is that you really want. So I do feel that in the making of economic policy, constant learning, feeding back into the design of policy what you've learned, and also learning when is it that a sensible policy is well implemented and when is it not well implemented, and what is it that is necessary to make it well implemented. And very often that what it is not actually politically acceptable.
Right.
I mean, for example, the most obvious thing is that teachers, school education is very important, and the system we are running, many people feel that there's no way of disciplining the teachers. I mean, they more or less do whatever they like.
Right.
It's tough to work out how to do this. And therefore you need to think, where is it that is going wrong?
So this is at the policy level, the larger picture. But even in making decisions, like the hunger for learning that I was talking about, you mentioned in the book, and we all know that you know, when you had your job in Washington DC twice, once in World Bank and once as the first president of the at the IMF, you know, you left all of that because you wanted to contribute, and that's where I said that desire to contribute is so much, and that hunger for learning, because
well, the two are quite different. I mean, in the sense that I always felt that the reason I wanted to join the World Bank way back in the late 1960s was because I felt that if I'm going to get involved in development, I should learn about what development does elsewhere,
right,
and experience of other countries. Actually, I originally thought I would only go for about 4 years or so and come back. Then I met my wife, Isha, my late wife, Isha. And then we had a kid, and it delayed coming back. But she was very keen also to come back. So the two of us together came back. Coming back was not driven by the desire for learning. It was driven by the desire to contribute.
Yes.
And she wanted to do that in her own area of research. I wanted to do that in government because I felt that I was interested in development policy. And you can't talk about development policy from an international organization. That's just coming and giving a lecture and everybody's nice to you and they say thank you very much and you go back. If you really want to affect development policy, you have to do it in your own country, which means you have to face the constraints, face the difficulties, persuade the politicians, which is a lot of fun, but it's also more difficult.
Right.
And I was very keen to do that. So in that sense, I don't think I came back because of a hunger for learning. I came back because I wanted to do this job.
Yeah.
I do think that what I learned helped. And the knowledge that different countries do more or less the same thing differently persuaded me that, there's not just one way of doing something.
Right.
And so you need to look, how is it that they are doing so well and we're not doing so well, etc., etc.
And going back in time, for you to become the person you became and the person you are today, was there a moment in time that you remember when your dreams became more important than your fears? Was there a turning point of that sort? That's something I didn't find in the book.
That's really a tough question. But honestly, my view is that the most important single moment probably was when I was told I'd been awarded a Rhodes Scholarship. Because, up to then I was going to go on the standard track, sit for the IAS exam, get into the IAS, all this kind of stuff. That would have meant I would not be an economist. I would just become an IAS officer, which in those days was regarded as a very big thing. But the moment I got the Rhodes Scholarship and I knew I was going to Oxford, I realized that now I could get a degree in economics that would have an economic value and maybe even a postgraduate degree, which I did. And that would give me a much bigger market to get a job. And I didn't have to join the IAS because the world was open. And it makes you realize that when you're thinking about young people, very often the most important decision they have to make will be the result of what happens to them during that critical period. I think this has implications for the future, particularly for parents. First of all, parents should realize that what they think is the best career for their children may not actually be. Because the kid may have totally different ambitions and capabilities.
Right.
Like when I was there, middle class parents thought, go into the government, go into the IAS. If you don't get into the IAS, go into the audit service or something. But essentially a government job, okay? A little bit later, everybody wanted to become an engineer or a doctor. And parents would keep pressurizing their kids.
Right.
It's unavoidable as a parent that you want to do the best for your kid. But very few parents appreciate the fact that, they're not in a position to judge what are a kid's real capabilities. And isn't it better to give them a range of options, which also has implications for education. Because you need to structure your education in a way in which a child can move from stream A to stream B.
Right.
And for example, in the United States, I was really struck that I once went to, I think it was Yale or somewhere, and I was speaking, and there was a young lady, and she asked some intelligent question. And so I asked her, what are you doing? And she said, well, I'm currently doing something, some architecture or whatever. But I'm going to go switch to medicine.
Wow.
So I said, you mean you can switch from architecture to medicine? She said, yeah, here there's a lot of flexibility. And they'll say, look, if you can pass these exams, we don't mind you moving in here.
Wow.
And that's really what we should do. Whereas in India, you either have an art stream or a science stream.
Right.
And once you've chosen that, and you choose that at 17 or something like that, then you're really on one track. And I think that's completely wrong. That's point number one. Point number two is that my generation was pretty much brought up to believe that you'll get a job, then you'll work hard in the job, then you'll work your way up to the top. So it's a grinding move, an irrevocable decision. A bit like what we thought of marriage, although that is no longer the case today. I think today people need to realize that, it will be quite normal for you to change jobs. And maybe you should change jobs in the sense that if I'm recruiting for something and I meet a candidate who says, I've been doing this for the last 15 years, I'm not that impressed. But if somebody says, I've had a mixed career because I did this, then I did this, and I did that, and I kind of did well in those things, but now I want to do something different. That person stands out as a person who is actually exploring the world. So I think we need to encourage our children that, just as you mentioned, there are options today. I mean, in those days, you either bought an Ambassador or you bought a Fiat, and that was it. There was no other. I mean, there are more important choices today relating to careers, choices, etc. And kids have to be encouraged to make those choices. But one of the ways you can encourage kids to make those choices is if the world is flexible. That having made a choice, you can change your mind.
I always say, like, I was working in a university in Australia, and when students would come to me for advice and they were confused, so I would congratulate them. I said, confusion is great, chaos is great, because it gives you the ability to explore.
You're right.
When your single-mindedness sometimes doesn't help you to explore other options. So, when confusion is great, chaos leads to order. So I said, this journey is beautiful, don't miss out on that journey. So I think that's the kind of thing that you're talking about as well.
Yes, I am. I think it's a very important thing that we must recognize that the economic circumstances of the parents is a very important factor. I mean, if your parents are kind of middle class or maybe even lower middle class, and they spent all their savings getting you educated, and they're running their lives on the assumption that you're going to look after them when they get old, then naturally they want you to have a good job. Otherwise, what the hell are you going to do?
Okay?
Once the situation is one where the parents are not looking to their children to support them and making their own arrangements for support, for which economic circumstances matter, then they're a little freer to let the kids do what you want. Now, I grew up at a time whose general assumption was that you better get a good job because you have to support the family. Now, as it happened, as I was growing up, my mother decided to work. So she took up a job as a secretary to the director of IIC. And she was one of the few people in her generation of a middle class origin who started working. And she was getting a salary after my father retired. So we were a little bit more comfortable, but still, the notion that kids have to do well, certainly the parents didn't think that they could support the kids, but they didn't. I think if today, probably most parents in this category know they can support themselves. Obviously, they want their children to do well, but then they can be a little more flexible in letting the kids decide what they want to do well in.
Right. I remember this one story that you shared in the book about your father, the sacrifices our parents make for us, which was, how you had to, your mother took you for a wedding and you had got a double promotion in school. You did that even then. And how he sat in classes.
He was convinced that if I go away for 10 days to Delhi, then I would fall back in school. And he was a workaholic himself. And he was very concerned about mathematics because the rest of the stuff he knew could be picked up. So he asked his office to give him leave for a couple of hours every other day and got permission from my teacher in my school in Secunderabad to attend the class and take notes.
That's so
totally ludicrous. I mean, but it just showed how much. And I think more importantly, I mean, he was not in the Indian Defence Account Service. He had joined the service as a clerk and rose up to some kind of officer status. and he had done well. And the system said, look, Mr. Singh, your work is excellent and we want to promote you into the IDAS. Now, you know, in those days, having IDAS next to your name was a big deal.
Right.
But they said, look, if we make you IDAS, you will become head of an office, but you will have to go to a smaller place because you'll have to be head of a smaller office consistent with what junior IDAS officers do. And you may not want to pull your kids out of school, etc., and go there.
Right.
And maybe the alternative is to do you a favor. We'll promote you to Delhi because then your kids can go to a better school.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
And he consciously gave up his promotion in order to move to Delhi so that his kids got a better education.
Wow.
And I would not have got a Rhodes Scholarship or even dreamt of it if he had been posted to some Mufassil place and we had finished our schooling there.
Right.
That's a huge sacrifice.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So I think creating an enabling environment at home is the first step. Like we talk about celebrating our gifts and returning to love. You know, when we started this whole journey about returning to love, it was like, how do you operate more from the space of love in your everyday life? And one of the things we felt, if we know what our gifts in life is, whatever it may be, like look at you, like you recognize your gift, you are celebrating it today. So how energetic you are and how full of life you are, even at the age of 80.
And I think, by the way, parents influence you in very subtle ways on values.
Yes.
Okay? My father never valued money. I mean, he just wanted to do an honest day's job and retire peacefully and simply and so on. And you know, he was very fond of one particular poem by Walter Scott, okay, which I remember him telling me about now. And it was very relevant when I went abroad, because obviously salaries abroad are much higher. Okay? But he had this very great fondness of this poem, which said something, went something like this. It said, "Breathes there the man with soul so dead, who never to himself hath said, This is my own, my native land, whose heart hath never within him burned, as home his footsteps he has turned, from wandering on a foreign strand." And then it goes on to say, "High though his title, proud his name, boundless his riches and wealth can claim, the wretch concentered all in self, doubly dying shall go down to the vile dust from which he sprung, unwept, unhonored, and unsung." Now that tells you all about, effectively, my father is saying that, look, you can earn a lot of money by working abroad, but come back.
Yes.
He didn't put it that
home.
way.
Yes.
And he didn't say to me when I was abroad. But early on, by emphasizing the importance of this poem, he sowed a seed,
Yes.
which I think made a lot of difference.
Right.
Of course, the interesting thing is that Walter Scott was not referring to immigrants from India. He was referring to all these British guys who would come to India and become Nawabs and earn a lot of money, usually through corruption, and then sort of return after they'd made huge amounts of money.
Right.
You know, Robert
So, yeah, his
Clive and
context
Warren
was different,
Hastings and
but,
people like that.
Yeah.
But still, it's the same point.
Exactly,
That, you know, you're just going there and earning money and coming back. What the hell does that do?
Yeah. It's the life of service is very different.
Yes,
Yes,
exactly,
yes.
exactly.
Yeah, with you, the vibration was never that you were doing a job. It was always that you were doing service, and you know, that's.
Well, I wouldn't say so. That makes me sound like a saint.
I mean, your life has a lot of examples of you being a great team player, and you've mastered the art of persuasion and consensus building. So how important are these qualities, and for someone who's wanting to make a change in a big organization, in government or anywhere else, could you give some...
Well, yeah, I personally think they're incredibly important. Particularly important when you're coming in at a middle level. I came into the government at a sort of joint secretary level. So you're entering an organization which has a lot of senior officers, etc. And you just can't come in a smart-ass kind of way and say, I'm the expert, listen to me. You need to persuade them, and as a good economist, you also know that economists also disagree.
Right.
So, for every economist to say something, you can dig out another who will say something different. So the name of the game is to persuade them that, listen, many sensible economists would do it differently, and maybe they have a point. Now, the effectiveness of this depends a lot on whether the system is responsive. I mean, if the system is rigidly hierarchical and people above simply don't want to listen, nothing much is going to happen. So I was lucky because I think at the time that I came in, first of all, people had begun to realize that we're not doing nearly as well as we think we should. That is, the economy in the days of controls had run out of steam. And when Rajiv Gandhi became Prime Minister, in his first speech in Parliament, I mentioned this in 1985, he made the point, quite spontaneously. I mean, I was an advisor, but I hadn't got to know him well by then. He made the point that, look, how can we compete with other countries if we are working with systems that are 20 years out of date? That's why I always felt that Rajiv Gandhi really wanted to be a change agent. I think it's a different matter that he wasn't able to make all those changes himself. He did try in a few areas, and he got swamped by political problems, the Bofors scandal, etc., etc. But the very first speech he made in Parliament, what he said was not that the systems are not working well. He said the systems are out of date. So there was an appreciation that we need to change the system.
Yeah.
It's not that the policies are not being implemented, but the system itself needs to change. So I think that created an awareness on the part of older people that, look, they should also think. And at that time, there was a lot of technical material available on what's wrong with India's economic policy. So I was pushing a lot of that.
You shared a very interesting example in the book. We always talk about having ownership of our ideas. But when you're in an environment, when you want to make things happen, so sometimes not having ownership of the idea, taking it to a senior colleague, like you mentioned, and making it like as if it's come out of the discussion, and not as if, it does get better. When you take it to somebody senior, then you take it to a bigger group. So I think those little things that one does contribute in a huge way. I mean, of course, systems have to be supportive, leadership have to be supportive, but there are these little qualities also that make such a huge difference where people don't see you as a threat anymore.
I think it's very important, and perhaps the person whom I would regard as my mentor in government most of all has been Mr Singh. And he gave the example of how you do these things, because I mean, I had known him for a long time before I joined the government, and I always admired what he'd done, and I wanted to do something similar. Now, he was an extremely good example of how you bring about change by getting other people on board. When he was in the process of announcing the big economic reforms in 1991, now remember, he was finance minister at the time, he called a meeting of all the secretaries and said to them that, look, gentlemen, in those days, regrettably, there was no lady who was a secretary, so he had to say gentlemen. He said, look, we're going to make big changes. And he said, I need your help.
Yeah.
See, without your help, we will not succeed.
Right.
So if you have doubts, raise them and I'll persuade you. If you don't agree, please don't sabotage the thing. And if you really don't want to be part of it, tell me and I will find you a better job. Wow. Now, the person who was at that time Secretary Economic Affairs was S.P. Shukla. Okay? He was a bit of a more old-fashioned, control-oriented economist, and he wasn't at all convinced about this. And Manmohan Singh knew that, and Shukla went and told him that, listen, I don't agree with what you're doing. So Manmohan Singh said, okay, we'll get someone else. And incidentally, that's how I got moved from Commerce Ministry to Finance Ministry. But first, what Manmohan Singh did was, I'll appoint you Executive Director of India in the ADB, which was a very comfortable 3-year job, and all that. Now, it's a reflection of Shukla's personal integrity and professional integrity that he said, no, I don't want a better job. I don't think this is right, and I just want to leave government. So obviously he was a committed person. I think he had the wrong ideas, but he wasn't going to be sort of tempted to just go to a better job. He just left.
Wow.
And that also was quite an example that, you don't always have to just look for yourself. I mean, you're taking a principled stand.
Yeah.
I was quite impressed by it. At that time, I didn't know that I was going to replace him.
Right.
But obviously, when they asked me to replace him, I said, oh, well, that's a bit of good luck, and moved into his job at that time.
Wow.
But what struck me was that here is Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, who outranked all these guys many times over. I mean, he had been secretary. He became secretary in 1974 or 5. And this was 1991. And most of these guys had just become secretaries 2 years ago.
Right.
And here he's saying to them, listen, I need you to work as a team, and I need your support. I think when you are the leader, people want you to hear them, okay? 1 or 2 people who may totally disapprove of what you're doing may want to make a principled exit, nothing wrong with that. But people who have different views from you, since you're in a leadership position, actually want to help. And if you're willing to listen to them, they also have the feeling that some of the worst consequences they fear might be taken care of, and you will get something better.
Yeah.
That's the crux of it.
So everybody is contributing. Even in
Yes,
opposing the
absolutely.
idea, you're there, everybody is contributing to
Manmohan
it.
Singh was unique in this because, when the global economic crisis broke out in 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed. Stock markets around the world collapsed. Everybody knew that countries would be deeply hurt. We didn't want to have to go to the IMF and all that. So we wanted to take precautionary measures so we control the situation. So Manmohan Singh, as Prime Minister then, called a meeting in which he had the Finance Minister, that was Chidambaram. He had me as Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. He had C. Rangarajan, who was Chairman of the Economic Advisory Council. He had the then Finance Secretary, and also Subbarao, who was a former Finance Secretary who had just taken over as Governor of the Reserve Bank. So this is quite a bunch of knowledgeable, at least we thought we were pretty knowledgeable. And in the middle of, we were discussing how we should react. And Manmohan Singh said to me, he said, where is Raghuram Rajan now? Because he had interacted with us, and I'd always told Dr. Singh that he was really one of the top macroeconomists in the world. So he said to me that, I said he's back in Chicago, he's left the IMF. He was chief economist at the IMF. So Manmohan said to me, look, why don't you write to him and say that I'm concerned, but how should we react to this crisis, and get his advice and let me know. So here is a guy who himself is regarded as a top-class economist who knew all the finance ministers and prime ministers himself. He's got a bunch of pretty knowledgeable advisors around, many of whom had international experience, including Subbarao, who had worked in the World Bank for a while. But he's looking around to see what other advice can I get.
Right.
And it was an interesting thing because when we were debating the issue, I disagreed with Raghuram Rajan because I said that, look, we need a fiscal stimulus. And Raghu said, fiscal stimulus is dangerous. He's a monetary economist. He said, you can have loose fiscal monetary stimulus, but don't try a fiscal stimulus too much.
Right.
So it was a clear case that you have to make a choice.
Yeah.
And of course, you always do a little bit of both. And so we did a monetary stimulus, but the big thing we did was a fiscal stimulus. And my argument then was, you do the stimulus for 1 year and then start withdrawing it. I think where we went wrong was that Pranab Mukherjee, who had taken over as finance minister in 2009, he continued the stimulus too long. And that was a mistake. I say so in the book, I think.
Right, yes, yes, you do.
But it gives you an example that, when you're running an economy which is integrated with the world, it's not just what the economy is going to do. You got to know what the rest of the world is going to do. How is it going to impact on you? What should you do in return? So, and the world is now even more complicated. So it is a world in which I hope that we create a much more consultative process in which policies are more openly discussed, and when they're fully discussed, they're implemented. And of course, when they are implemented, then I think you should just implement them, not kind of allow all kinds of people to create a logjam and a policy paralysis. And we had a bit of that in the UPA in the last 2 or 3 years. And that was partly because it was a coalition government. I mean, it's not easy.
Yeah, decision making is never easy. And when it's a consultative process.
I mean, it's tough. If you're dealing with multiple parties, that creates some difficulty. But that's the challenge, actually.
One of the things that I want to ask you is, a big part of your career has been to focus on growth, India's growth. But the way we are moving, I recently spent a lot of time in the forest in Darjeeling, and my dear friend Utsur Pradhan gave me a new vocabulary in introducing this term called gross natural abundance, which is when the soil is rich, the air is clean, the AKI is better, when there's clean water and all those things. So, when you look at the bigger picture, so growth is not always the answer, maybe in that bigger picture.
No doubt about it, by the way. I mean,
you say it in your book also. One of the regrets.
When I was deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, I clearly said that growth is not the only solution.
Or indicator.
Well, it's not the only indicator of progress.
Right.
It is an important, let me say, those who believe without growth we can make progress are just plain wrong.
Yeah, of course.
But those who believe that as long as there's growth, everything is all right, are also wrong.
Right.
So in the 11th plan, we had said growth must be inclusive.
Yeah.
Okay, that means you can't just have growth with the top 10%, 5%, 1%, even 20% are benefiting and everybody else is left out. It must trickle down to everyone, okay? And otherwise it's not politically sustainable. Now that trickling down can take many different forms. I mean, some people can say, well, it's not come to my state. So you've got these backward states. In other parts of the country, it may trickle down even to the lower end. So poverty may be going down.
Yeah.
But if in some states it's not happening at all, then those guys will say, what is this growth? Who cares about whether India is growing at 7% if I'm only growing at 2%? Okay?
But I want to understand from you, has your definition or understanding of growth changed?
Yes, it has.
And also abundance. How do you define abundance?
When you say
or
changed,
expanded,
Well, in the 12th plan, what we said was we need faster, more inclusive and sustainable growth. So the whole issue of sustainability, I mean, a growth which pollutes your waters, a growth which deforests your forests is counterproductive. No question about it.
Right.
Now, the problem is that in our system, many of these areas are not in the control of the central government. I mean, water is something where really the states are the most important determinants.
Right.
And what does the central government do? Well, we have to recognize that and come up with some discussions where we can solve these problems. The same thing is true of forests. The actual implementation of forestry is really with the state governments, but we had huge problems during the UPA. For example, a lot of the mining guys would say that there's a terrific coal reserve, but it happens to be in a reserved forest. Well, our view was in a reserved forest, no mining. If there is a lot of reserve, go and look for coal somewhere else, you know.
Right.
So I think these are issues which we knew about. We did try to do something about. I don't think we did a good enough job, because I think if you look at the last maybe 10 years, not just 10 years means this government, the last 20 years, including the UPA. UPA and NDA, the 20 years, if you ask me on environment, were we able to arrest the deterioration in the environment for the country as a whole? I would say no.
Yeah.
What has happened though is a better appreciation that this is a problem. A lot of people's involvement
Yes.
in villages and schools and this and that, but that hasn't got translated into support for sensible pro-environment policies. I mean, for example, if you ask the majority of your NGOs, should we have cheap power for everybody, they would say yes. Well, they're wrong. I mean, I think if you're going to go for renewable energy, it's going to be more expensive than coal, because coal does not bear the cost that it imposes on the environment. So you need to recognize that you're going to phase out coal and bring in a more expensive energy which is cleaner. But for that, somebody's got to pay. Now, if you decide to say, no, you can't raise the electricity rates, I must have free electricity for farmers, free electricity for people, poorer people, and poorer people is defined to include half the population, then I mean, basically the electricity system will become financially unviable and you will generate lots of shortages, okay? Same thing is true of water. I mean, people are totally unwilling to pay for water. India is urbanizing. The urban areas are doing well. They're the ones that have high income, but they all want water to be brought from 200 kilometers away, which actually deprives rural areas of water, and they want the government to pay for all that expense and not charge them. Now, frankly, if you were to charge people for water, the water distribution system would be financially viable, it would prevent leakage, it would invest in maintenance, and people would also use water more economically, the richer people.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you have 6 cars, you're happily washing them all twice a day because the drivers have nothing to do. I mean, that's ridiculous. You know?
Yeah.
I don't find anger amongst NGOs, and you should ask your friends. I don't find enough anger on that. See, it is, to my mind, it's perfectly possible to say that the bare minimum of water is a human need. So you decide what it is. If you think it's 40 liters a day, and a family of 5 is 200 liters a day,
Right.
that is about multiplied by 30, and you will get so many kiloliters a month.
Right.
And you can give that many kiloliters can be very cheap. Anything above that should cover the full cost.
Like, yeah, have it to your system. I think things like this also need that consultative process that you were talking
Well,
about.
it needs, yes.
With everybody having a seat on the table.
You need to
and-
educate people. That's the main point.
Yeah, but first we all need to come on the table to have
I've
a
been
discussion.
writing on climate change quite a lot in the last couple of years,
Right.
and that comes out very loud and clear. That we need a much broader, I call it a participatory process, because the political system must educate the public,
Yeah.
and then kind of, educate politicians who otherwise will whip up the public in the wrong direction.
Right.
So that's tough.
We are working through arts for social change.
Yeah.
So, maybe find more creative ways of educating people.
Yes,
than not
absolutely.
just
100%
discussions, yeah.
right, I think.
Yeah.
That's what you need to do. And frankly, I think, kids who grew up, the world learnt about the problems of the environment dominantly in the Rio Summit 1992.
Yeah.
Before that, environment was there, but it was not very important. Now, 1992 was 30 years ago, okay? So that means that anybody who is today, let's say 40 years old, was 10 years old at that time.
Yeah.
That person has got no inherited sensibility about the need to control use of water, the need to price it properly, or any of that. These are the politicians.
Right.
So I think you need today's schools, kids coming out of school, if every kid coming out of school were to have the sense that it's good to pay for electricity, it's bad to give electricity free. If you're concerned about the poor, give them a cash transfer so they can meet their essential needs, but not free electricity. You would have done a huge service. So these are long-term things. I mean, the kids are now 12 years old, will have a vote in 6 years' time, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
unless politicians face an educated public, there's no reason why they will do any different.
Right. Oh, that's very important. And believing in young people and involving them in these kind of processes is something that will go a long way.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah. One last question I want to ask you, and then I want to move on to a very exciting part which we call the rapid fire round. Just quick questions there and short answers. But before that, just my last question. Have there been any personal values which have helped you in your decision-making process, both professionally and in your personal life?
That's very difficult because you can't. I'm not a great believer in the notion that people act on the basis of certain values. I think a lot of action becomes instinctive. So if you have these values, they are somewhere deep in your consciousness.
Right.
But I do think that the idea that the idea of basic honesty. That if you have any position, don't misuse it to get unintended benefits, and that's a value that I learned from my parents.
Right.
And I think I've tried to live up to that as much as I could.
Yes, you certainly did. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
That's a great answer. So, with the rapid fire round, okay. So, if you weren't an economist, what other profession do you think you would have excelled in?
Well, I always wanted to be an economic journalist.
Wow.
I was keen on that because I knew that this is a subject that interests me, and journalists play a very important role in seeding ideas.
Wow, beautiful. So, if you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would it be and why?
That's a very
Somebody
good question.
you've not had dinner with. You've had dinner with a lot of historical figures.
Well, I think Pandit Nehru actually, because he dominated India's thinking during my younger days, and I met him once at a youth festival.
Wow.
It would be nice to, because I had a sense that he engaged frankly with people, younger people, and I would choose that.
Wow. What's the most surprising thing that you've learned about Indian economy in your career?
I think the variation across the country, and this is a big problem because if you're talking about Goa and Tamil Nadu, you're talking about states at very different levels of development than if you're talking about Bihar and other backward states. I mean, it was obvious even earlier, but when I thought more about it, I realized that it needed to be much more ingrained in our policy making than it is.
And I think one thing that I read between the lines in your book is India's economy having resilience the way it does.
Having?
Resilience, bouncing back, when things happen, like we have the kind
Yeah, but that's not a surprise. I mean, I was very sure that if we made these changes, it would bounce.
Wow.
So
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point you made, that's not a surprise, so yes. If you could invent a new economic indicator, what would it measure and why?
Very good question. Actually, I would like a good indicator of what is the quality of our education.
Okay.
Because judging by standard exams is hopeless. And if somebody, we do have an indicator by ASER, which doesn't go to schools, it just goes to children
Right.
and subjects them to simple tests. And those tests show that the quality of our education is lousy. I think we need to systematize this much more.
Okay, excellent. AI is the new buzzword. So how do you see AI in economics? I know
Don't fully
it's-
understand it. I mean, it's clearly the new buzzword. It's too early to tell whether it will really impact productivity. But I think we should, as long as it's there, we should be open to it.
Right.
And we should recognize that it will have some negative effects on employment in some areas, but it will generate different kinds of employment, and we need to. But it's at the moment too early to tell whether it's just a little add-on
Right.
or whether it's a totally transformative thing.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's a great point. Any misconception, like a common misconception about economists?
About economists?
Yes, like.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's lots of misconceptions about economists, but the most important thing to learn about economists is they're doing a very difficult job trying to characterize very complex systems and sort of characterizing them so that you can tell that if you do this, that will happen.
That's a misconception? That's not a misconception.
No, the misconception is that they don't understand. That is true. They don't understand because it's too complex. So in order to understand or in order to get reasonable results, you always have to simplify. The idea that you will be able to analyze very complex systems, then you get into AI. And you get into methods that you don't understand yourself.
Yeah.
So of course they're dealing, people think that economists don't understand their own limitations. Any good economist understands that. But it's never a sensible thing to say, your model doesn't reflect the world. Of course it doesn't reflect the world. The world's too complex.
Right.
But you have to ask him whether he's simplified it wrongly.
That's a great point. Yeah. If they've simplified it wrongly, yes. And
No,
sometimes
very
AI
often
does
they do.
that.
Yeah, very often they do.
Yeah, not just AI, people do that too. If you were to write a children's book on economics, what would be the title and what would you want them to learn?
Well, actually, I would not want to write a children's book, but I'd love to write a cartoon book. There are some already. There's a lovely cartoon book on microeconomics and another one on macroeconomics.
Right.
But it's a little too much sort of Western oriented. So if you're going to have a cartoon book for Indian children, that would be terrific.
Yes, and children could read them too, and so can adults. It would
Yeah,
just
I
be
think
an
adults
interesting
might,
way
because
to-
most adults never read after. They think that the economics they learnt in university is still valid.
Right.
Whereas if you made a cartoon book, they would read and understand what's changed.
Right. And since you are talking about reading, are there any books that you would recommend currently, in your, that
Well,
everyone should read?
I now read a lot about history and looking
Right.
back and so on. So I can't recommend any one book, but
But any book on your bedside table currently?
Well, I mean, there is a book by Mike Spence and Muhammad Al Aryan and somebody else on, the current dysfunctionality in the world. And that's an important issue that everybody is now looking at, because the world is actually splitting apart. So, but I don't recommend that for a general reader. I mean, it's a bit complex.
Right. The role of behavior economics. The role of
Very,
behavior-
very important, because almost all economics is based on the assumption that individuals are rational and that they maximize utility, and we all know that that assumes that there are no external effects, that they're full information, there's no asymmetry of information, none of which is true. So first of all, the characterization that individuals are maximizing utility is not actually correct.
Right.
Also, I think it's increasingly realized that a lot of decisions are instinctive. You don't derive things from some analytic construct. You have some instinctive reaction, which may be based on some past analytical conception. So I think you need to understand that in human behavior. I mean, that's why, for example, in a lot of cafeterias around the world, particularly in colleges,
Right.
The first dishes are always the healthy ones, and then the dessert comes right at the end. And the hope is that by the time they've gone past this, they'll have put enough food on their table,
Right.
the ice cream and other stuff at the end.
That's nudge as well, right?
That
The
is very
nudge,
much
yeah,
nudge, yes,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
nudge.
So
yeah,
introduce
absolutely.
more of nudges in, more cost-effective
Yeah, but you
ways
know,
of-
the nudges have to be clever. I mean,
Yeah.
between stupid economics and stupid nudges, it's very difficult to judge. Just because it's a nudge
Right.
doesn't mean that's a good nudge.
Right, yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that people don't know about you, something fun.
Ah, I enjoy.
Well, I can tell that also.
What?
I can tell that also, but you go ahead.
Well, I mean, this requires me to know what others know. And since I don't know what others know, I can't answer that question, basically.
Or something interesting about you that people should know.
That I take a lot of interest in what my grandkids are reading in school, and even read their textbooks in order to be able to interact with them on what it is they're being taught.
Wow, that's beautiful. And also, will you share your French onion soup recipe with us?
You can get, nowadays you can get a French onion soup recipe from Google. Just do
Well,
French
I'm
onion
sure.
soup, it comes out.
But do you still cook that?
Actually, I've instructed my maid to be able to do that, so I don't do it myself. But I take an interest in it because
Yeah.
my grandkids love it actually.
Wow. Yeah.
In the
yeah.
winter.
Yeah. Do you spend time cooking? Like
Not really, not really.
Okay, so that was a speciality. Well, that's ending on a good fun note.
Thank
you
you.
so much for your time.
No,
It
no,
was
thanks
lovely
very much.
chatting with you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.